Well, dear listeners, on this occasion I thought I would bring you not merely a single lecture, but an entire series devoted to Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. I should warn you at the outset that the material is immense. These lectures took me well over a year to write, and even now I have the sense that I am only just beginning to do justice to the scale of the man. Goethe's life, or to speak more precisely, Goethe's literary life, is so vast, so many-sided, and so rich in transformations that it resists easy compression into an hour or two of speech. My first plan, in fact, spread the material across 14 long lectures. I then set myself the somewhat heroic task of reducing them to 10, and after no small internal struggle, I managed at last to shape them into 10 lectures of roughly an hour each. Even so, on paper they run to well over 100 A4 pages, and I write densely, with single spacing and very narrow margins, so that may give some sense of the scale of what lies before us. Even with that labor behind me, I will not present the entire sequence here all at once. Offering these lectures one by one seems to me better, perhaps also more fitting, because each deserves its own air, weight, and line of development. Today, then, I invite you to the first of them, entitled Cabinet, Window, and the Making of a Mind, Frankfurt, Family, Leipzig, Strasbourg. As some of you may already have noticed, I have acquired the habit of structuring these lectures around a central object, phenomenon, or, a little less frequently, an idea. There is usually some governing axis upon which the whole argument turns, some concrete or symbolic center that bears the weight of the questions I want to ask and the claims I want to make. From that center, the lecture unfolds through a sequence of movements, usually 3 to 6, each marked by its own question, and each carrying us a little further into the work, the life, and the historical moment in question. The same method governs this opening lecture as well. Here we will concern ourselves with Goethe's early formation, with what I would call, in the broadest sense, his youthful period. We will look at the Frankfurt household, at family discipline and cultivation, at the first shaping of the mind through rooms, books, objects, and expectations. Then we will follow him outward, through Leipzig and Strasbourg, into those early encounters that enlarged, tested, and began to transform him. In other words, this lecture asks how Goethe became possible before Goethe became Goethe. So with that, I invite you to listen. What does the cabinet know about the child before the canon begins? Before fame acquires public shape, shelves register weight with the patience proper to wood, stone, brass, paper, varnish, leather, and dust, each material pressing its distinct claim into the grain of the room. Within an 18th-century Frankfurt house, a cabinet stood in daily authority as an instrument of custody and selection, drawing into itself minerals, drawings, books, small instruments, family order, paternal intention, and maternal tact. Long before Johann Wolfgang von Goethe assumed monumental stature in the European imagination, he passed through rooms already composed as an education in sequence, value, and form. The bourgeois interior of his childhood carried a doctrine of cultivation in physical contour, so that learning took visible shape through movement among objects, under the steady discipline of domestic attention, within a world of things already sorted, named, and placed by an earlier hand. From the first, the boy entered a life in which knowledge had assumed the visible grammar of furniture. Such a point asks for patient attention. Goethe entered Frankfurt am Main on August 28, 1749, as the eldest surviving son of a prosperous patrician household, whose habits joined civic standing to cultivated ambition. His father, Johann Caspar Goethe, lived on inherited means, possessed legal training, retained the memory of extensive travel, and directed sustained energy toward the education of his children through a serious commitment to books, art, and ordered study. His mother, Catharina Elisabeth Textor, came from one of Frankfurt's leading civic families and brought into the dwelling a social vividness that kept its discipline in motion. That residence belonged to an urban bourgeois order in which money, dignity, cultivation, privacy, and aspiration cohered within a single domestic fabric. The essential biographical facts establish the frame clearly: birth in Frankfurt in 1749, paternal status, and a classical education already shaping the early mind before Leipzig. Materials from the Goethe house give sharper contour to the interior itself by presenting a library of about 2,000 volumes, private tuition extending across almost the whole span of childhood, and a curriculum that moved from languages into geography, natural history, drawing, calligraphy, music, and manners. Under those conditions, the residence served as more than a setting for formation. It enacted development as a daily discipline whose rooms, possessions, and routines carried pedagogic force. My opening emphasis falls upon the cabinet, because furniture offers an image of interior order at the very moment when private life has yet to speak fully in its own voice. A chest of drawers already implies rank, separation, category, and access, while its structure furnishes a material analogue for the sorted consciousness a cultivated household seeks to produce. Within that logic, the cabinet appears as a form of guarded order, preserving what it receives, concealing what it holds, and granting entry through discipline joined to an acquired sense of where each thing belongs. Goethe's youth in my reading begins under precisely that sign. His father assembled books, pictures, aids to study, tokens of travel, materials of self-improvement, while the son received through those objects something larger than possession alone. What descended to him was a grammar of arrangement, a habit of understanding the world as something that could be brought within, named, shelved, compared, and held before the educated eye in ordered relation. Literature would later become the medium through which Goethe extended that inherited grammar into artistic form, even while the tension lodged there urged him toward a larger, more difficult freedom. A window belongs beside the cabinet from the first sentence. Storage answers to sight. The shelf gathers within itself while the pane opens outward. Frankfurt in Goethe's childhood gave him a wealthy commercial city, a free imperial urban republic whose ceremonious yet active civic temper took shape in trade, found public expression in ritual, entered daily life through legal culture, and displayed itself in public rank. He grew up as a town child of a rich family in an essentially middle-class world, apart from the petty courtly dependence that marked many other German writers of the age. Such an origin left a deep mark. Goethe's mind formed itself in a house of accumulation, yet within a city whose windows looked upon exchange, movement, public ceremony, and worldly traffic. His birth placed him within a room where bourgeois culture believed itself capable of total cultivation, far from the peasant hut and equally far from the princely palace. One can feel the father's hand in the arrangement. Johann Caspar Goethe appears again and again in the sources as a man of collected seriousness. Within his working room lay the most valuable portion of the library, while instruction reached the children either directly through his own efforts or through the agency of private tutors. That curriculum bore the stamp of amplitude. Latin and Greek formed one tier of study. French, Italian, English, and later Hebrew opened another range of acquisition. History, geography, geometry, natural history, music, drawing, and deportment completed the design. Goethe House even preserves the memory of the boy's workbook, Labors Juveniles, a name almost too apt, given that the future writer's early life carried the labor of cultivation in its title. Here the fault line already shows itself. Education in such a household arrives as a gift, confers privilege, imposes burden, and generates expectation. A boy receives the world in ordered fragments, yet each fragment arrives as duty. Another force moved through the same rooms, with a different rhythm. Catharina Elisabeth, much younger than her husband, entered the family memory as socially vivid, quick in response, playful in manner, warm in company, and rich in narrative ease. Later witnesses loved to cast the parental dyad in emblematic terms. They assigned method to the father, while imagination passed to the mother. Such neat division always threatens to become after-the-fact mythology, yet the contrast carries value if handled with care. The father made the cabinet severe, while the mother kept air in the room. Through him, acquisition took the form of rule. Through her, cultivated domesticity carried liveliness. A house can educate through severity alone, though that sort of regimen often breeds timidity or rebellion. Goethe's good fortune lay in this doubleness. The same interior that trained him into measure also admitted play, charm, sociability, tale, and dramatic ease. The family picture is spare, though the implication is large. The household gathered father, mother, and sister Cornelia into the surviving sibling bond within a house marked by many dead children. Survival itself tightened intimacy. The family circle bore both fullness and fragility. Cornelia enters decisively here. A cabinet often receives objects in pairs, and Goethe's youth carries that paired quality in human form. Close in age to her brother, she shared tutors with him, occupied the same rooms, took part in the same intellectual exercises, and joined him in reading and observation, so that his inward life took shape beside a sister who served at once as companion and mirror. Later readers, tracing Goethe's recurrent tension between intimacy and self-centralization, can already discern the pattern established in this early domestic proximity. Another consciousness remained near at hand, cherished, formative, and bound to his development, even as his own powers pressed toward a scale that exceeded the common orbit of family life. Under such conditions, discipline first appeared as a shared authority, while literary vocation emerged in time as a force that departed from that common measure and carried pain in its movement. What, then, did the child inherit in human terms? He assumed confidence that culture belonged under one roof, and along with that confidence came a habit of treating inner life as a subject worthy of grave attention. Paternal ambition reached him through the medium of education, while maternal fluency entered the same formation through anecdote, through effect, and through social modulation. From the bourgeois household as a whole he received the conviction that self-making could proceed through disciplined encounter with language, with books, with art, and with manners. Such an inheritance appears at first as a generous endowment, yet its deeper character comes into view when one recognizes the demand folded within it. A world arranged with such care asks the receiving child to justify its labor, its expectations, and its faith in cultivation. Within such a house, the son must grow into a stature commensurate with the dwelling itself, for the ordered shelter of formation can, under accumulating strain, assume the character of suffocating enclosure. That strain begins long before any open crisis acquires a visible name. The cabinet stores order, and order carries the faint atmosphere of enclosure when it governs every object in advance. One can picture the boy moving among minerals and drawings, passing by bound volumes and small instruments, lingering over maps and works of art, and absorbing devotional residue together with school exercises, each thing marked by a place, a use, and an implicit claim upon attention. In such a room, every object bears a label, whether written upon its surface or inscribed through habit, and every item belongs within a structure of placement beloved of the paternal mind. A future poet formed under those conditions confronts an early seduction. He may become the perfect heir to arrangement, learning to classify experience before he submits himself to its full force, and translating living impulse into decorous exercise before necessity has entered the line. That danger clings to Goethe's first phase. The early lyric carries grace in its movement, quickness in perception, charm in address, a light erotic convention in posture, and rococo residue in texture, so that the reader hears accomplishment before necessity and sees dexterity before existential heat. The city outside complicates the room within. Frankfurt offered ceremony in abundance, and its public life unfolded through coronations that displayed imperial continuity, civic pageantry that trained the eye in rank, religious variety that gave difference a visible place, mercantile movement that kept exchange before the senses, visiting strangers who widened social reference, official processions that translated authority into motion, and conversations conducted across class lines under regulated conditions. Such a setting formed an important school for the writer, who would later display unusual plasticity of perspective, for he grew within a place where urban life rendered hierarchy visible, and gave social difference a ceremonial shape. A cabinet teaches classification in miniature, while a city teaches classification at civic scale, and the child moved continually between shelf and street, carrying habits learned in private collection into the wider theatre of public life. Through that oscillation, Goethe acquired one of his deepest habits, the linking of inner order to worldly spectacle. Education in such a house also meant early reading under supervision, within a library where Homer offered one kind of authority, Klopstock another. Latin authors in handsome editions gave antiquity a formal body. Travel literature opened distant horizons. Law books imposed civic seriousness, and dictionaries, encyclopedias, together with other aids to orderly consultation, instructed the eye before they fully nourished the imagination. Goethe later remembered his father's library with care, noting classical authors in Dutch editions, the presence of Roman antiquities, Italian writers, books of travel, and the full apparatus of learned reference, and that recollection carries significance beyond antiquarian curiosity. The child grew in a room where texts appeared as a civilizational inventory, so that reading entered his life as a form of architecture, teaching the mind to range across domains, training the eye to compare epochs, and showing the imagination at an early stage how antiquity could stand beside Italy, how law could rest near travel, and how scripture, literature, together with urban modernity, could inhabit neighboring shelves. Few beginnings explain the later Goethean breadth with greater clarity. Yet breadth in youth rarely feels broad from within, for management accompanies it at every turn, and here the cabinet acquires psychic depth. To inherit such interior order means to receive a pre-composed image of completeness, already shaped by a house that has decided knowledge belongs with taste, language with refinement, and social grace with measured curiosity within a single economy of cultivation. A gifted child thrives in that atmosphere for a time and begins to shine within its frame, though the claims of talent eventually reveal that even a generous frame remains a frame. At that point, the self begins to hunger for an event that exceeds storage and refuses the fixed destination of the shelf. Leipzig enters at precisely that juncture. Goethe went there in 1765 to study law in accordance with his father's wishes, and the move preserved an obvious continuity with the domestic plan, for legal studies suited family dignity, while university life promised the recognized avenue of bourgeois ascent. Yet Leipzig, polished and urbane, offered more than jurisprudence alone. The student arrived to read law, then quickly gained notice for poetry in a lyric and rococo mode, gathering the early love poems later associated with Annette. The father's arrangement had sent him into the world, and the son immediately began to convert assigned formation into literary performance. Even so, the first Leipzig Goethe keeps the cabinet intact and adorns its inherited structure with new taste. Leipzig served as an epical threshold. Frankfurt had educated Goethe under paternal sovereignty, while the university city confronted him with society in a sharper, more public form. Fashion entered his experience as social test, polish in manners acquired new consequence, learned conversation and the graces of cultivated urban youth passed from the status of family possession into the more exacting sphere of lived competition. A house can teach a boy to speak French or scan Latin. A university town reveals whether that cultivation carries breadth, ease, and persuasive force in company. In that setting, the young Goethe entered an Enlightenment world touched by urban refinement and by the fading perfumes of Rococo aesthetic culture. Sentiment had already begun its expansion across Europe, while German literary self-assertion gathered energy within the same historical air. He thus occupied a charged interval in which order met feeling, decorum encountered emotional surge, and paternal expectation pressed against emergent singularity. That intermediate condition explains much in the early poems. One hears imitation, fashion, literary borrowing, and pleasing surfaces. Yet within those surfaces another energy already presses against the limits of acquired manner. I read this phase as the record of a mind acquiring voice through the testing of available voices, and such testing deserves a more generous valuation than later readers sometimes allow. Juvenile lyric often appears slight when readers seek only necessity's claims, yet these poems reveal what inherited cultivation can accomplish at the level of the line. Grace comes first, and force gathers behind it. Light convention trains flexibility, while imitation itself acquires value when the future writer absorbs tone, learns cadence, studies erotic pose, acquires rhetorical ease, and masters miniature form. In this period the cabinet becomes portable, for Goethe carries arranged culture within him as a living internal discipline. Even so, some interior strain had already begun to abrade that polished surface. An ornamental talent of a lesser order would have settled into ease. An accomplished bourgeois son of a more conventional type might have matured into a polished lawyer with literary habits. Goethe moved instead toward crisis. Illness in 1768 broke into this phase with brutal intimacy, bringing severe physical weakness and a long convalescence whose later consequences reached far beyond diagnosis. Whatever medical language one adopts, the event carried force within the self, because bodily frailty interrupted the smooth continuity between social polish and self-development. Illness narrows the world, and the cabinet then ceases to signify order alone, assuming instead the atmosphere of confinement. A shelf stands near a sickbed in more than spatial terms, for each arranges the body in relation to what exceeds its immediate powers. Convalescence deserves greater philosophical weight than literary history often grants it. A youth trained toward comprehensive cultivation encounters his own flesh as limit, and the orderly self, so carefully furnished by paternal education, begins to feel fracture from within. Time slows, and reading changes its temperature, so that books once approached as instruments of cultivation begin to speak with new weight, drawing the convalescent mind into devotional currents, occult interests, and a more searching mode of introspection, through which religious unrest acquires sharper definition. Amid bodily weakness, speculative hunger also gathers force, for the intellect, deprived of its former ease of motion, turns with heightened intensity to those ultimate questions that suffering brings forward with singular clarity. My point concerns exposure and deepening. Illness revealed the distance between cultivated acquisition and existential security. The cabinet had gathered books and tools with exemplary care, yet suffering brought into view a more difficult truth, namely that interior order, however ample, must pass through vulnerability before it can become fully human. From that moment onward, interior order bears a second face. In one aspect it remains a treasure house in which language finds storage, memory retains its claims, art preserves its shapes, and form holds possible selves in reserve for future articulation. In another, the same arrangement assumes the character of enclosure, becoming a chamber within which consciousness circles back upon itself, studies its own motions, and risks the burden of excessive furnishing. Great writers often begin within such doubleness, for a sparse inflowing life leaves energy unshaped, while an overfull inheritance can press living force beneath arrangement. Goethe's early development acquires its particular brightness through that tension, because abundance reaches him early and its claims become palpable before habit hardens into permanence. The return from illness also sharpened the family dimension. Frankfurt again enclosed him with rooms shaped by expectation, routines sustained by habit, comfort sanctioned by familiarity, and protections offered by domestic order, and such a return could carry the warmth of recognition, even while deepening the sense that fragility had altered the terms of belonging. A young man who has passed through bodily suffering re-enters the childhood interior with changed consciousness, and the cabinet now bears witness to that alteration, for physical trial has taught him that arrangement offers discipline, shelter, and order, while the deeper claims of existence ask for something beyond domestic symmetry. Once lodged within him, that knowledge begins to seek a literary outlet. Strasbourg supplied the decisive opening. Goethe went there in 1770 and remained into 1771 in order to complete his legal qualification, and the period brought with it an intellectual and emotional awakening of unusual force. During those months he encountered Johann Gottfried Herder, whose conversation taught him to understand language and literature as the expression of a people's historically specific genius, audible in Shakespeare's reordering of dramatic possibility, in folk song as the bearer of communal memory, in the ballad as the condensed form of inherited feeling, in Luther's energizing of sacred speech, and in national language as the living medium of historical existence. At that moment the window flies open. The cabinet had trained Goethe to collect, compare, and order works, while Herder taught him to hear life moving within them. Herder merits a longer, more deliberate dwelling of thought. A father's library offers books under the sign of possession, arranged within the calm architecture of inheritance, each volume resting as part of an ordered estate that teaches reverence for form through custody, sequence, and finish. Herder brings literature forward under another sign altogether, speech in motion, tradition passing from mouth to mouth, utterance gathering authority through communal use, historical depth carried in living language, vernacular energy shaping culture from below, and collective memory entering the world through song, cadence, and recurring speech. The child formed among shelves learns to admire completed structures, to honor the dignity of what has already taken shape. Yet the young man who enters into intellectual commerce with Herder encounters the generating energies from which such structures first emerged, the vital sources through which form took hold in the life of a people. Under that altered vision, Shakespeare ceases to stand merely as an eminent English dramatist, preserved among other distinguished names, and begins to appear as a power that tears through Frenchified decorum with native amplitude and dramatic freedom. The ballad undergoes a similar transfiguration. Its status as primitive material gives way to its fuller character as national remembrance made audible in song. Scripture, too, changes aspect, for the Bible no longer presents itself chiefly through doctrine or philological interest, but discloses itself as an immense verbal potency whose authority lives in utterance before it settles into system. Through such influence Goethe's attachment to order remains secure at the level of substance, yet the principle by which that order organizes itself moves away from static arrangement toward vitality, growth, and the active life of forms as they arise within history. Strasbourg also widened him through place. As an imperial border city marked by a more mixed cultural atmosphere, closer to French intellectual traffic and exposed to Gothic architecture in its overwhelming local form, it offered a setting less paternal in feel, less governed by domestic enclosure, and more charged with historical amplitude. Cathedral space carries special force here, for even within a lecture governed by the cabinet one must allow the vertical counter-image through which Goethe's scale of perception altered. The cabinet gathers laterally, while the cathedral rises, the shelf invites selection, while the tower imposes awe. Goethe's celebrated response to Gothic architecture belongs to this transformation of scale, because a youth formed in rooms suddenly confronts stone that seems to think beyond rooms. Culture now appears as more than something that can be owned, arranged, and placed before the eye. It appears also as a power that seizes the mind, enlarges interior measure, and compels submission through scale. Love entered that awakening as well, and in the young Goethe its presence almost always arrives already joined to literary consequence, so that emotional experience and artistic formation move together within the same current of development. The episode at Sessenheim with Friederike Brion belonged intimately to the Strasbourg transformation, for Goethe encountered the pastor's daughter in the Alsatian countryside under conditions that brought cultivated sensibility into living contact with rural immediacy, and the emotional intensity of that meeting fed some of the most vital lyric utterance of his early period. Later reflection may gather a moral gravity around the history of that attachment, yet the literary truth of the encounter retains its full authority, for the youth, shaped within the cabinet, trained among urban rooms, books, paintings, and carefully ordered lessons, came upon a mode of speech through lived affection that carried a warmth, directness, and human nearness beyond anything Rococo refinement had previously sanctioned. Under that change, feeling ceased to present itself as ornament laid delicately upon experience, and began to assume a more necessary relation to utterance itself, while song moved closer to lived need and took on an urgency that gave the human voice a deeper charge. I would state the larger point in this way. Strasbourg released Goethe from inherited interior order by deepening that order, enlarging its range, and exposing him to living sources of speech. Herder guided him into a learning re-rooted in life, while Friedrich drew speech closer to lived emotion through the pull of attachment. The cathedral, in turn, placed the house within a larger scale, and gave inherited formation a new proportion within the young man's experience. That sequence explains why Strasbourg belongs so firmly within this lecture's movement from cabinet to window, for he discovered there that interior cultivation becomes fruitful when it submits itself to powers larger than its own prior arrangement. What age, then, did the young Goethe enter? He entered a late Enlightenment world, already troubled by the refinement it prized, where order retained prestige, reason commanded honor, and classical education continued to signify serious formation, even while deeper currents of sentiment, historicity, primitivism, vernacular discovery, religious unease, and national cultural hunger moved beneath that disciplined surface. Across the German-speaking lands, literary self-assertion had begun to seek its own forms, while dependence upon French models sat with increasing unease upon younger spirits who sought a more native source of force. One can hear a generation asking whether genuine power might arise from local speech, popular song, Shakespearean amplitude, Gothic inheritance, and a fuller climate of feeling. Goethe entered that age at the very moment when a brilliantly furnished bourgeois mind could gather its contradictions into form and give them voice. Leipzig and Strasbourg therefore stand as more than university stations, because each city dramatizes a principle within Goethe's formation and gives a distinct contour to his developing consciousness. Leipzig intensifies acquired polish and refines the cabinet through the disciplines of urban sociability, while Strasbourg breaks that polish open from within and throws the window wide upon historical soil, local speech, bodily passion, and collective memory. The first city shows the young Goethe how culture circulates within civil society. The second reveals culture as a force rising from deeper sources and returning to form with altered energy. Through that contrast, one strengthens form while the other gives form weather, velocity, and breath. Let me return now to the early work. Juvenile lyrics, sketches, experiments, imitations, occasional poems, and lighter pieces in the mode of Rococo sensibility often receive treatment as a prelude through which criticism passes quickly on its way to Guts or Werther. Yet a mind-gathering voice frequently reveals its inner mechanics with greatest clarity before mastery folds those workings into apparent ease. Within the early poems one can trace several distinct tendencies. One delights in ornament, miniature elegance, flirtation, and verbal charm. Another reaches towards sincerity while still speaking through available convention. A third begins to compress feeling into image. A fourth reveals unease within borrowed posture. Such strands deserve patient attention, because they preserve the evidence of a consciousness testing, which parts of its inheritance can be made to sing, and which forms of acquired cultivation can bear the weight of emerging personal force. Annette and the Leipzig songs belong to that testing, for the line often moves with a pleasing ease through which desire assumes a stylized shape, and the beloved appears poised between literary emblem and social presence. Even at this early stage, a peculiar quickness of perception flashes through the finished surface, and Goethe learns how to animate a small scene, how to pivot from observation toward feeling, and how to turn an address into a miniature drama. Form here serves as an apprenticeship in motion, while the cabinet, with its many drawers, offers the governing image for a poet opening one chamber after another, and trying voice as one tries instruments. The delicacy of kleine Blumen, kleine Blätter already shows how lightness of manner can carry alertness of perception within a miniature frame. Strasbourg lyric alters the balance by drawing song closer to immediate experience, by granting landscape a new vitality, and by stripping gesture of some of its decorative distance. Part of that transformation arose from Herder's esteem for folk energy and song traditions. Another impulse came through erotic experience felt with greater directness. A further enlargement issued from the expanded field of consciousness opened by historical and architectural encounter. A poem such as Willkommen und Abschied carries that changed pulse in a form where ride and night, meeting and separation, physical feeling and outward scene move together with psychic motion, while the cry, Es schlug mein Herz, geschwind zu Pferde, gives that urgency its unmistakable opening beat. What emerges there is a poet who has moved beyond the arrangement of cultivated impressions, and has begun to stake himself in the utterance, so that the cabinet remains in place even while wind now passes through it. Imitation, then, deserves a more exact account than a simple verdict of weakness would allow, because it names the phase in which inherited order studies its own resources, while experiment marks the stage at which those resources shift through friction, and personal force appears once experiment ceases to remain a trial of styles and becomes a risk borne by the self. Early Goethe traverses all three conditions within a remarkably short span, and that compression helps explain why later Europe could look back upon his youth and perceive prophetic scale in forms already gathering future magnitude through friction, illness, influence, attraction, and dissatisfaction. What sort of dissatisfaction comes into view here? At this point, the lecture reaches its metaphysical turn, because the cabinet becomes at once treasury and enclosure when interior cultivation begins to feel like confinement, and such confinement can appear under the aspect of success as readily as under any darker sign. The young Goethe possessed gifts, education, standing, room to maneuver, urban polish, and access to books and languages. Through that very abundance, the question of self-making acquired urgency. A poor youth may first contend for means, whereas Goethe contended for necessity, for the ordered life of the mind that he inherited gave him so much that he stood in danger of becoming merely its exemplary product. Literature became the site in which he could answer that danger. That answer took a form peculiar to Goethe, because he used bourgeois spiritual order as a means of enlargement, allowing it to expand beyond the condition of finished possession. One sees this pattern repeatedly in his life. A limit presents itself, then the response takes shape through assimilation, transformation, and expansion. The father's curriculum opens into living range, Leipzig refinement yields material for self-critique, illness deepens reflection, and Strasbourg influence brings liberation through reordering. Later crises follow the same rhythm, for his formation carried too much substance for pure destruction, while his vital energy carried him beyond the repose of a museum piece in his father's house. In that sense, the cabinet becomes an image of early consciousness itself, each drawer bearing a different charge within the forming mind. Inherited language lies in one recess, literary models occupy a neighboring space, family expectation settles into another chamber, unspent erotic energy waits elsewhere in reserve, the fear left by illness lingers in its own compartment, social ambition claims a further place, religious unease enters another depth, and delight in visible things, stones, prints, instruments, architecture, gesture, costume, fills a final section with the vivid density of the scene world. The future writer feels these chambers within himself, although at first he lacks a form capacious enough to let their contents enter relation with one another. Literary self-making begins at the moment when those private partitions begin to strain toward exchange. A window offers the counter-image through which that strain passes into motion. At Strasbourg, under Herder's shaping influence, Goethe turns beyond the enclosed private interior and begins to seek the wider sources from which the cabinet had already drawn its contents, turning toward Shakespeare, Gothic art, national utterance, inherited song, the countryside, and emotional truth tested by lived experience, though paternal design had revealed only part of that relation. Order comes to the child as inheritance, while the youth advances toward origin, and every major widening in Goethe's development depends upon the recognition that culture lives before possession, assigns it a private address. Although Homer may rest upon a shelf, epic acquires reality in recitation, in memory, and in transmission across generations. Ballads survive in collected form, yet the communal life that endowed them with authority continues beyond the room that preserves their text. Even printed tracery, for all its capacity to render the visible grammar of Gothic design, yields architecture's full claim upon sense and intellect only when a person stands beneath the vault and receives height as experience. Socially, that transformation carries a meaning one should keep firmly in view. The bourgeois household places its faith in cultivation, achieved through acquisition, whereas the literary age into which Goethe steps asks for originality joined to genius, for felt truth joined to historical ground, and for expression capable of answering the claims of its own time. Within that tension one encounters the collision between family formation and epoch. Greatness came to the young Goethe through his ability to meet the new demand while retaining the intellectual equipment conferred by the old order, for he possessed an education substantial enough to absorb the unrest of his age and convert agitation into form. Where another figure might have gained momentum at the expense of structure, Goethe gained momentum through structure itself, and that conjunction gave his development its rare power. Readers return to his youth when they seek an explanation for his later scale, because the proportions already appear there in concentrated form. Breadth of reading, visual alertness, attention to objects, urban poise, sensual responsiveness, historical curiosity, linguistic appetite, susceptibility to influence, capacity for mental crisis, and an unusual power of reorganizing experience all belong to the signature of the mature Goethe. Yet youth presents these powers in compression before later achievement disperses them across a larger field. The cabinet in Frankfurt already contains the polymath in embryo, although only history, illness, love, conversation, and cities can teach those latent contents to move. A further reason draws readers back to the young Goethe. They sense in him an unusually legible version of a problem extending far beyond one writer or one century. By what process does inherited interior order become a life instead of a cage? That problem belongs to any cultivated child who receives much before choosing anything, and it belongs with particular force to those reared among books, rules, refinement, expectation, and educational abundance. Such persons often appear fortunate from the outside, and that appearance carries truth, yet their formative labor can prove severe, for arrangement must be converted into vocation, and inheritance must show whether it will live as habit or rise into actual power. Goethe's youth offers one of Europe's clearest instances of that conversion. The family house in Frankfurt therefore deserves significance beyond pilgrimage sentiment, because it embodies a whole anthropology of culture in visible form. The library room in which lessons likely took place, the painting cabinet where art hung in intimate proximity, the implements of study, the bourgeois rooms oriented toward public reception, together with the domestic spaces shaped by the mother's sociability, show cultivation materialized before it ripens into an inhabiting fate of mind. The description of the library proves especially revealing, for Johann Caspar placed there the most valuable part of his collection, and thereby made the room itself into a program of formation. He sought for his children the education he esteemed most highly, while private tutors carried almost the entire burden of that design. Languages held the place of honor, while music, drawing, geography, history, natural history, and manners extended the same ambition into a broader discipline of life. Such a room produces more than knowledge alone, for it forms a consciousness trained to assume that the world yields itself to disciplined accumulation, ordered attention, and patient comparison. Goethe carried that belief forward even when his development pressed beyond the frame in which it first took shape. One may ask whether such an upbringing also helps to explain the lifelong habit of composure, the power of synthesis, and the disciplined self-command that later readers have so readily associated with Goethe. An answer begins to emerge at once. Once it is understood that moderation in his case did not arise from ease or placid balance, but came into being through contest, resistance, and an intensely lived energy that required form if it was to become fruitful. Those early years make the pattern intelligible, for a nature governed only by equilibrium would likely have ripened into a cultivated Frankfurt gentleman, distinguished by admirable finish and social polish, whereas Goethe possessed an amplitude of vitality that demanded a larger field of action and a more exacting destiny. The cabinet gave him an architecture of mind, yet the age into which he stepped summoned him toward expansion, exposure, and risk. Greatness depended upon the encounter between those shaping powers, one preserving structure, the other opening room for vehement life, and his earliest formation prepared precisely that charged union. That conjunction also casts new light upon the father. Johann Caspar can appear in literary memory as stern pedagogue, serious collector and household sovereign devoted to instruction, and such a figure easily invites caricature through the very intensity of his purpose. A more exact reading discloses something larger and more consequential, for the father built conditions under which extraordinary powers could gather substance, range, and discipline. At the same time, paternal order carried within itself the temptation to treat preparation as destiny, as though the apparatus of cultivation already contained the final shape of the life it formed. A son may honor such labor most deeply by carrying it beyond the horizon first imagined for it, and Goethe's youth bears precisely that quiet filial drama. The household cultivated a mind capable of more than the household itself could foresee, so that gratitude and burden entered together and remained joined from the beginning. The mother's place within this drama comes into clearer view once that paternal structure has been properly seen. If the father represents order gathered into cabinet form, the mother represents the social breath through which cultivated order gains suppleness, warmth, and human motion. Narrative vivacity, wit, ease, theatrical presence, together with a warmer relation to the textures of everyday life, contributed something essential to the formation of a writer who would unite learning with animation and breadth with dramatic tact. A richly furnished interior can yield scholarship, collection, and discipline, yet literature comes into being through motion linking stored form to living encounter, joining social improvisation to the resources of possession, and carrying presence through what has already been gathered. Through her manner of being in the household, she sustained that motion and preserved the vital circulation by which the boy's formation could ripen into something larger than erudition. Leipzig then becomes the first public proving ground of that familial blend. The son of a learned, wealthy urban house entered a polished university city, and there stood inherited cultivation against peers, fashion, desire, and taste in the active medium of social life. He discovered an ability to write, a capacity to charm, and a graceful ease in imitation, each gift revealing that domestic cultivation could survive public exposure and even flourish within it. Through illness and incompletion, however, a further lesson entered the same experience, namely that charm and polish answer only part of the self's demand, and leave deeper claims still pressing for form. The cabinet had travelled well into the world, carrying its order intact, its resources available, and its refinements visible, yet necessity still awaited its hour of full disclosure. Strasbourg answers by changing the terms of interior life. Herder's intervention deserves renewed emphasis, because it altered the very logic of literary value for Goethe, shifting greatness away from accomplished mastery of approved models toward fidelity to the living powers through which language, history, peoplehood, song, native force, and dramatic amplitude acquire authority. A cabinet gives order to what already stands before it, whereas genius brings fresh order to what lives, moves, and presses beyond inherited arrangement. In those years Goethe crossed precisely that threshold and entered a conception of literature in which form drew its sanction from energies more original than cultivated correctness. The shift becomes palpable when one listens for temperature. Frankfurt childhood carries the warm polish of an educated interior, while Leipzig glows with salon light, elegant surfaces, and a faintly powdered air suited to accomplished sociability. Illness cools the chamber and draws the sufferer more deeply into solitary sensation, after which Strasbourg brings rougher weather into the line through stone underhand, the urgency of riding, the exposure of the night road, the force of strong affection, the reach of larger speech, and the weight of historical wind. The poetry follows that change in climate, for voice gathers power at the moment when life ceases to arrive in a shape already formatted by inherited decorum. That movement helps explain why the cabinet never disappears from Goethe's later story. He passed beyond formation by converting it into instrument, and the ordered life of the mind acquired in youth remained a durable source of power throughout his career. One sees that mark in his power to absorb disciplines without dispersion, in his habit of balancing interests that might have split a lesser intelligence, in his ability to compose from wide materials while preserving form, and in the patient observational practice that filled notebooks, sustained scientific inquiry, informed practical administration, renewed older works, and kept enlargement possible across decades. At the same time, the image preserves the memory of what development required him to outgrow, namely the merely inherited, the excessively arranged, and the furnished privacy of consciousness that can mistake possession for life. Readers who seek the later giant often search the years of youth for signs of destiny, as though the child in Frankfurt already contained Faust in miniature. I regard such hindsight with reserve when reverence begins to soften its edge, for the sterner lesson lies elsewhere. Youth held usable materials, durable habits, latent tensions, permissions granted by privilege, and burdens imposed by formation, while the canon arose through no automatic enlargement of what the household had already stored. Literary stature emerged because ordered consciousness became exacting enough to demand self-making through form. Goethe inherited conditions under which greatness became at once possible and necessary, and the true significance of those early years resides precisely in that severe conjunction. So I return to the opening question: what does the cabinet know about the child before the canon begins? The cabinet records a process of arrangement already underway, within which the child receives something far more formative than comfort, for the ordered space of the house delivers books, drawings, minerals, instruments, portraits, lessons, family rank, paternal aspiration, maternal vivacity, urban ceremony, private tutors, linguistic abundance, and the whole cultivated apparatus of a Frankfurt bourgeois interior as a structured inheritance of form, sequence, and expectation. Such ordering confers privilege as a palpable gift, and at the same time places upon the life shaped by it a demanding burden of justification, while the same cabinet bears witness to the child's unusual appetite for objects. The early pleasure form gives him the quickening energy of comparison, and the promised language already holds as an activity moving beyond the bounded exercise of recitation. By the time he reaches Leipzig, the cabinet has learned something further, namely that inheritance can achieve beautiful performance while still remaining incomplete. Illness discloses a second lesson, for an ordered life of the mind can tighten into chamber existence when suffering presses it back upon itself. Strasbourg then brings the revelation that the self formed among shelves and drawers will seek its truth in forces exceeding storage and arrangement. Herder's conversations, the upward surge of Gothic form, the Alsatian road, the young woman in the parsonage, the recovery of older song, and the awakening to national and historical life together teach the heir of a cabinet how to open a window. That, I think, gives the meaning of Goethe's youth. At first the cabinet appears simply as furniture within a prosperous house. By the close, it stands as the model of an ordered life of consciousness from which Goethe emerged and against whose limits he had to press. It preserves treasure while imposing boundary, teaches classification while provoking expansion, and furnishes the mind's first architecture before compelling that architecture to discover air. Within that tension lies the beginning of literary self-making. Because the child inherits an ordered spiritual life, the young writer turns that order into a problem, and the future Goethe begins at the moment when the cabinet can no longer contain the life it has so carefully prepared.